Good afternoon. I'd like to start by thanking Sarah, Andrea, and Shahana with the Center for South Asia, Katie and Carrie with SASLI, all of my friends with Wisley in the language program office, and of course, all of you for coming to this talk after what I remember well as a long day in the classroom. I'm a two-time SASLI and actually also CIASI alumnus, and I know how mentally and intellectually and even emotionally draining and exhausting it can be. And so I want to commend you for spending your summer intensively learning a new language, even though some days can be quite difficult, and of course, other days really fun and rewarding. I promise you that on balance, it'll be worth it when by the end of the summer, you can look back at this time and to see just how much your language skills have developed. Stick with it. I believe in you. You're going to do great. I'd also like to apologize for pre-recording my talk instead of giving it live. By the time that all of you are sitting down to listen to this, it'll be 1:30 in the morning here in Sri Lanka, where I'm currently conducting research this summer. I promise, however, that I'll join you soon for a period of conversation, discussion, and Q&A. So today I'd like to take us back to the middle decades of the 18th century, between the 1740s and the 1760s, in order to think about how early modern Sri Lankan and Thai Buddhists experienced complex, fraught, even dangerous forms of maritime mobility, religious mobility, diplomatic mobility in the context of the greater Indian Ocean world in which they inhabited. In other words, I'd like us to get onto the ships with 18th century Buddhist monks and diplomatic envoys who crisscrossed the Bay of Bengal and try to reconstruct their journeys in the late age of sail as they sought to restore what was then a rapidly declining ordination lineage for Buddhist monks in the heart of what's now Sri Lanka by bringing in ritually qualified monks from Siam, what's now Thailand, in order to confer new ordinations. And of course, I'll say much more about that as we go along. But first, I think there are a number of really important contexts and dynamics that would help us on our journey today. Certain aspects of the history of Sri Lanka, the history of Buddhism in this part of the world, and more. So let's build some of that context before we depart on our journey. And I think this is really important for a number of reasons. If we're talking about what historians and scholars and many Buddhists themselves now refer to as Theravada Buddhism, a connected Buddhist tradition that's most popular in Sri Lanka, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Burma, right? We talk about this as a form of networked diplomatic connectivity across the Bay of Bengal, which has been going on since at least the 11th century. And if we expand our circle much earlier than that, but what I want to talk about today represents the first instance in which that connectivity was put into the hands of European commercial and political intermediaries, and in this case, into the hands of the world's first transnational joint stock corporation. So get ready, it's kind of a wild ride. All right, so before we get there, I'd like us to first build some context from the world of much earlier Buddhist literature and ritual practices, and try and gain some bearings before we see how these later generations of Buddhists drew on really similar ideas and ritual orientations in the mid-18th century as they sailed across the Indian Ocean on the ships of the Dutch East India Company. We'll start out then by examining just a tiny sample from the pre-modern or ancient Buddhist period, a series of texts that give us glimpses into how ancient Buddhists managed the danger of maritime mobility as a way of leading us into the historical questions and archival sources I want to explore. Then we'll follow along the journeys of actual Buddhist monks and diplomatic envoys who crisscrossed the Bay of Bengal in the late age of sail, considering the risks they encountered and managed, the dangers they faced, and why they did it. But before we get there, let's start off, as I mentioned, by looking at an early example of Buddhist life on the ocean waves from the ancient period. So, in a lot of the Buddhist texts and stories popular amongst seafaring communities throughout the ancient Indian Ocean world, texts like the Saddharma Pundarika Sutra, or for those of you who are studying Sanskrit, you might recognize this as the Lotus Sutra, we find numerous examples of bodhisattvas, or powerful and moral Buddhas to be, who intervene in the suffering of everyday people, providing miraculous aid, for example, to mariners in distress. For instance, there's this beautiful line right in the Lotus Sutra: if one should be cast adrift on the great ocean, the abode of Nagas, or mythical serpent deities, sea monsters, and demons, who but recalls the power of Avalokiteshvara, who is a powerful bodhisattva or Buddha to be in the Mahayana tradition, that person shall not perish beneath this kingdom of waves. Now, as Buddhist people, practices, stories, ideas, and orientations like these increasingly flowed out from the Indian subcontinent across China and Southeast Asia along the Silk Roads and sea lanes of the first millennium, so too did the idea that Buddhas and bodhisattvas, like the compassionate and skillful Avalokiteshvara, could be looked upon to provide safety in times of trouble and distress. So I want you to keep this idea in mind because it's going to come back later. Ultimately, what I want to explore today are the stories of Buddhist envoys and monks who set sail between the kingdom of Kandy, here in what's now the center of Sri Lanka. And in fact, this is exactly the city that I'm sitting in right at this moment. And Ayutthaya, about 60, 70 kilometers north of Bangkok in what's now Thailand, as they moved across a mercantilist and monsoon world between the 1740s and 1760s as diplomatic agents of the Dutch East India Company, which I'll refer to as the VOC, or in Dutch, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or sometimes just the company. And the VOC's local governors and agents hoped to improve the company's economic and political relationships with both the Kandyan and Ayutthayan courts from its base of operations here in Batavia, or what's now Jakarta, Indonesia. And I want to look to these stories to push against the grain of a Buddhist studies literature, which examines the histories of monks and the development of their monastic lineages as a static phenomenon, one grounded in particular places and particular times, in which texts like the Lotus Sutra, which give us glimpses into the anxieties and concerns of seafaring Buddhist people, are understood merely as sources of religious or moral inspiration. I think there's more going on here, but what? So by following in the wake of actual Buddhist people who set sail across the early modern Bay of Bengal in the mid-18th century, we enter a world of porous political boundaries, seaborne European trading empires, and the powerful monarchs, princes, headmen, monks, and envoys of Kandy and Ayutthaya, from whose lands and laborers the Dutch company aggressively sought to derive a profit in a wide range of commodities. The company's governors and local agents hoped that by ferrying Buddhist monks across the sea on behalf of two kingdoms with which they had rather different relations, that they might induce the political and religious elites of each kingdom to agree to more favorable trading terms and more desirable economic concessions. For their part, Kandy's kings, courtiers, and monks had a rather different set of preoccupations and concerns in mind when they quite literally employed the Dutch company to ship monks back and forth over the dangerous monsoon waves. And in Kandy, by about 1737, the numbers of Buddhist monks who, for multiple different reasons, were ritually qualified to perform ordinations of new monks and to train new monastic students had precipitously declined. And so its kings sought to do what previous generations of Sri Lankan monarchs had done, bring in fresh monks from mainland Southeast Asia in order to conduct new ordinations and to restore the monastic lineage as a sacred part of their kingly duty. The Dutch, however, had control over the island's coastal littoral and exercised a treaty-backed blockade of its most important ports in Jaffna, Manar, Puttalam, Negombo, Colombo, Galle, Matra, Batticaloa, and Trincomalee. All the island's deep water ports, for the most part, were under Dutch control. And so the isolated and mountainous Kandyan kingdom, whose greatest extent in the 18th century I have here shaded in gray, while it was still politically independent, it was effectively landlocked in the middle of the island, and it was forced to work through the Dutch company's governors, merchants, and traders, based primarily here in Colombo, as well as Galle, whenever they wanted to make contact with foreign states or religious sanghas abroad. And of course, this was a situation that was very carefully engineered by the Dutch over the previous century. But as the company's profit margins began to shrink precipitously in the middle decades of the 1700s, they hoped to use Kandy's desire for foreign religious diplomacy as a bargaining chip to gain greater access to the fertile cinnamon cultivation lands, which were tenuously shared between the indigenous kingdom and the company's coastal territories. Okay, so the best cinnamon in the entire world grows here in this sort of coastal strip, kind of in between the Dutch ports on the southern coast and the southern extent of the Kandyan kingdom. The situation in Ayutthaya was starkly different. In Siam, the company was one of numerous trading interests: Portuguese, French, Malay, Gujarati, Arabian, Chinese, Japanese, British, and more, who were perennially jockeying with one another for the favor of the reclusive Siamese king and court. Oftentimes, the Dutch could only buy those commodities prized in a variety of inter-Asian markets from the Ayutthayan king's own storehouses and at fixed prices, and oftentimes at a financial loss. And so, with a very different balance of political and economic power in play, the cosmopolitan and urban Ayutthayan financial and political juggernaut, in essence, beat the Dutch company at its own game. And thus, local Dutch agents had hoped to show a new face to the Siamese court as an innovative experiment in the mid-18th century, as brokers of Buddhist diplomacy, as emissaries of Kandy's desire for foreign monks. What could go wrong? It turns out a lot. In trying to answer that question, a whole bunch of other questions sort of came up in the course of my research. And in service of answering those, I want us to get out from those sometimes static and disconnected accounts of Buddhist and colonial history. I want us to get into the boats with the monks and envoys to try and reconstruct what they experienced, the many dangers and difficulties especially, and to examine what drove them, how they faced those dangers, what those dangers were in the first place, and how they accounted for their eventual success, as well as what that success meant to them. We'll examine how older strata of Buddhist literature served as sources of orientation and inspiration as 18th century Sri Lankan and Thai Buddhist envoys and monks stepped aboard Dutch ships in the wake of previous failed voyages and moments of peril and disaster at sea. We'll see how ideas presented in ancient Buddhist literature and iconography formed a kind of living tradition in their performance of religious rituals of protection and veneration in the midst of all kinds of dangerous hazards. Monsoon squalls in the middle of the ocean, shipwrecks, running aground in unfamiliar territories, navigational errors, even violence, illness, and death experienced at sea and in foreign lands, as well as ship captains and crew who lacked scruples, who lacked skills, or who lacked both. In order to reconstruct these motivations, itineraries, and forms of danger, I'm reading across sources in multiple different languages: Pali, Sanskrit, Sinhala, Thai, and early modern Dutch, from archives, temples, and other sites in Sri Lanka, Thailand, and the Netherlands. And it really is just a terrible job that somebody has to do it, right? And so I read across, as well as beyond the Dutch language records of the VOC's interactions with Kandy and Ayutthaya to try and conceptualize not only what Sri Lankan and Siamese Buddhist monks, envoys, kings, and courtiers experienced, as well as how they engaged the company, but also to try and understand the ways in which they characterized their crossings and experiences as a virtuous and morally praiseworthy endeavor, an ethical duty even to restore a declining Buddhist lineage, and a diplomatic project shared between two Buddhist kingdoms, separated by a dangerous sea and mediated by the commercial and economic ambition of the Dutch company. We'll reconstruct their journeys and the hazards they faced from travelogues, biographies, religious and historical chronicles, and sources from the Dutch archive too, like this letter, which was sent to the VOC governor in Colombo from an Ayutthayan Buddhist monk some months after he arrived safely in Kandy, following a protracted 3-year voyage from Siam, which we'll examine shortly. For historians of the Indian Ocean and scholars of Buddhism alike, there's tremendous value, I think, in reading across materials produced in different languages, in different contexts, for different reasons, and for different audiences, precisely because they reveal really different experiences, different motivations, rather different subjectivities and preoccupations. Okay, so let's look at one last source from the ancient period before we sort of turn the rest of this talk over entirely to the 18th century. In the diverse streams of Jataka literature, which contain many examples of danger and miraculous rescue at sea, Jatakas, if you're not familiar, are hundreds of different stories woven together, which jointly narrate the multiple previous rebirths of the historical Buddha long before he took birth as Siddhartha Gautama and attained enlightenment. They detail his gradual moral development as he engages in various tests of his ethical cultivation and of his mindful equipoise, rebirth after rebirth after rebirth, each time gaining critical skills necessary for his eventual Buddhahood, when he does eventually finally take rebirth as that prince of the Sakyan kingdom in what's now southern Nepal. And in one of these stories, the Suparaka Jataka, the Buddha-to-be, again a bodhisattva, was a skilled merchant mariner who went blind due to prolonged exposure to the salt air. He found a second career, a lucrative one, as someone able to accurately gauge the value of any commodity, gift, person, or animal by touch. And at one point, the bodhisattva is compelled to accompany a party of fellow mariners and merchants on a hazardous expedition through successive oceans in search of riches. He had, after all, deep knowledge of the places they would travel. And so, after gathering much treasure on their journey, the party finally approaches a sea, which is given in the text as the Vallabhamukha Sea, which in Sanskrit refers to the mouth of the mare, a mythological sea creature with the head of a she-horse and a body of flame. As they approach the sea, the Bodhisattva warns the others against proceeding any further, shouting, "Friends, once a ship has got to the Vallabhamukha Sea, there is no returning. If the ship gets there, she will surely sink and go to destruction." Suddenly, the Bodhisattva's companions hear a terrible noise and witness the sea swirling down into a great chasm in front of the vessel. They fear for their lives and cry out. The Bodhisattva then does something rather unusual. He asks them to bathe him in scented water, to clothe him in fine white linens, and to place him upon the bow of the ship with another bowl of water. Having done so, he then performs a religious ritual. He pours the water into the sea while reflecting on his own virtuous conduct and his own strong moral character. Now, based on the karmic merit he accrues through this act, he bids that the ship will return safely, which it does, the text reveals, flying effortlessly through the air and returning home unharmed, with its accumulated riches and the lives of its passengers intact. A number of scholars, for instance, Sarah Shaw, have argued that in many of these Jataka stories, the safe crossing of a hazardous river or of an expansive ocean filled with unknown dangers serves as a metaphor for one's cultivation of liberation from the perils of suffering and rebirth. This was, after all, the central preoccupation for early Buddhists. Here, the image of disaster at sea becomes a moral and pedagogical allegory that naturalizes the kinds of catastrophes that all sentient beings, including humans like us, are liable to experience by virtue of our ignorance and our desire. At the same time, these stories serve to reinforce the moral skills and virtuous qualities of the Buddha to be, a remarkable being who acts courageously and compassionately in times of suffering and danger, who serves as a source of refuge, or sadhana in Pali. And remember this term, refuge. It too is going to come up again soon. Now, in the early modern period, too, the mobility of seafaring Buddhists was also full of danger. While the monks and envoys who sailed between Sri Lanka and Siam in the mid-18th century did not, so far as any of the sources I've found suggest, encounter any mythical beasts or monsters with horse heads and flaming bodies. They did experience much hardship and danger. And so I want to look at their journeys one by one, beginning with the first attempt of the Sri Lankan Kandyan kingdom and court to try and obtain mainland Southeast Asian Buddhist monks with the aid of the Dutch colonial enterprise. And while there are no records of mythical sea creatures, they were, it seems, still afraid of monsters. Consider a text called the Sangharaja Sadhucaryava. This is a 1779 biography of one of Kandy's most important monks, a monk named Sadhanankara, who was, again, one of the leading lights of the Buddhist community at the time. He was, in fact, an advisor and tutor to Kandy's kings. And his biography reveals how, still as a novice, before he receives the ordination from the Siamese monks who will soon arrive in about a decade, how he desperately wanted to restore that defunct monastic higher ordination lineage by bringing in foreign monks from Southeast Asia. And in the biography, Sadhanankara vows that even, quote, if during a sail overseas for ordaining monks, if a monster would tell us that further sailing won't be allowed unless we sacrifice one of our own, I myself will be sacrificed to allow the others to go on unharmed to a country where they can receive the ordination and return it to Lanka. May they thereby propagate Buddhism by transferring karmic merit to our excellent king. Well, my sources, again, don't suggest that the envoys and monks who crisscrossed the Bay of Bengal between 1741 and 1756 in search of foreign monastic lineages encountered any monsters. The rather perilous undertone of Sadanankara's vow, I think, is nevertheless apt. Beginning with Kandi's first attempt to secure monks in 1741, nearly every voyage across the sea encountered trouble. So let's see what happened. Okay, so in January 1741, having been convinced by none other than that novice monk Sadanankara to search for foreign monks, and after a lengthy and tendentious negotiations with the VOC, the Kandyan king Sri Vijaya Rajasingha dispatches a mission to the Colombo VOC fort, ultimately bound for Siam. It was headed by two Kandyan envoys. Their names were Doranagama and Vilbhagedra, together with novice monks from 5 villages. And I'm using this word novice because, again, the opportunity to receive the higher ordination had been cut off. And so we refer to them as novice monks. They received the lower ordination, but not yet the higher ordination. Right. Okay, so they carried a royal letter in the ancient Pali language from King Srivijaya Rajasingha to get, as well as numerous gifts for the Siamese king. They depart from the port of Colombo on February 23rd, 1741, aboard the Dutch ship Constantia, which is bound for Siam with stops in Batavia and Malacca. The ship and the envoys arrive in Batavia on April 28th, where they rest until June 4th. Then they set sail for Malacca, arriving not so long after on June 19th, where they rest again until the following month. At around this juncture, news reaches the VOC's forces in Batavia and Malacca both that relations between the VOC and the Ayutthaya king had once again broken down, and just trust me on this, to get into it would take way longer than the time we have, but feel free to ask me about this later. And so Doranagama is informed that a further voyage at this stage to Ayutthaya is out of the question. And so after some negotiations, he's able to convince the Dutch authorities in Malacca to send the mission onward to Bago in what's now Burma or Myanmar instead, where previous Lankan monarchs had in fact brought monks in during earlier medieval kingdoms. And so they depart Malacca on July 6th, still aboard the ship Constantia, and they sail for approximately a month, and they begin to encounter weather that grows worse and worse and worse. The ship soon loses 2 of its anchors, and by September 10th, the captain determines that it's no longer seaworthy, and it runs aground on a sandbank off the coast of Bago. The Sankaraja Sadhucharyava contains a description of this event, relaying that, quote, our ship hits the sand in a shallow part of the sea when approaching Bago. As it sinks, the novices from one of the villages and the youth go ashore with the help of rafts where they head upland. The rest of the people drown at sea, along with the manuscripts, the royal gifts, and letters. Thieves robbed and beat the novices and the young men, but there are still some sympathetic, virtuous people who treat them with kindness. The survivors, the Dutch crew, the 2 envoys, Doranagama and Vilbhagedra, and some of the novice monks are then brought by a passing English vessel to the mouth of the Irrawaddy River Delta. The Kandians ask the English forces stationed there to be transported to Bago, but they refuse. While they're there, Doranagama does in fact establish contact with Buddhist monks in Bago, but without the royal letter from King Srivijaya Rajasingha, this drowned with the sinking of the Constantia. He's unable to conclude any arrangements with the Burmese court, and thus the VOC governor Daniel Overbeek later reported to Batavia he reluctantly decided to return to Kandy. Meanwhile, the other envoy, Vilbhagedra, does manage to contact the Ayutthayan viceroy at Tenasserim, who assures him on behalf of the Siamese kings that monks would be made available if he could supply adequate means for their transport and protection and safekeeping, something he absolutely could not do at that point, and thus he too makes his way back to Kandy empty-handed. 5 years later, in 1747, a second mission comes together as the VOCs over harvesting of cinnamon and pepper make them increasingly dependent on Kandy's good graces in hopes of expanding their agricultural cultivation base northward toward the interior of the island into lands claimed by the Kandyan kingdom. Despite the loss of the company's ship, the Constancia, in 1741, 1742, the balance of economic, and by the way, like the loss of a Dutch ship in service of a diplomatic mission that for the company had no ostensible economic return on investment was understood as a huge loss, right? So it takes them 5 years to negotiate another mission. And so in light of this, in light of the company's increasing dependence on the good graces of the Kandyan kingdom, they come back once again to the bargaining table. And so in January 1747, a second mission sets sail toward Ayutthaya in search of Siamese monks. This mission, too, I'm sorry to report, also ends in failure. Let's see why. Okay, so once again, the envoys who are selected by the Kandyan king Srivijaya Rajasingha include Doranagama Rala and Vilbhagedra Rala, along with 2 other envoys and their retinue of attendants and servants, numbering around 40 altogether. The envoys and novices depart Kandy in early January 1747. They set sail for Batavia aboard the VOC ship Voitkensdorp from either Colombo or Gaul on either February 4th or 6th. My sources disagree about these details. The ship arrives in Batavia on either March 15th or March 17th, where another company ship, the Sara Jacoba, has been waiting with explicit instructions to forward news back to Colombo about the envoy's safe arrival there. At around this juncture, 2 important events happen which make a really significant impact on the success of the onward mission. First, while resting in Batavia, the Kandyan envoy Doranagama becomes really seriously ill, and he's left behind while the rest of the envoys set sail for Siam. The Sangharaja Sadhucharyava reports that he subsequently dies in Batavia, just as the ship reaches Siam. And furthermore, quote, some of the other envoys died while they were in Siam, while others die during their return. Only Vilbhagedra Rala returns safely to Lanka. Now, while Doranagama's illness does not alter the course of the mission's onward voyage to Ayutthaya, nor does the subsequent death of some of the other envoys avert its chances of success, another death does. A text called the Siamupasampada, one of the envoy Vilbhagedra's 2 travelogues, relays that the Kandyan king himself, Srivijaya Rajasingha, dies in Kandy just after the mission set sail from Batavia to Ayutthaya. Vilbhagedra, in his travelogue, suggests, quote, while the king sent ministers abroad as before with presents and letters, soon after this he departed this life. The ministers who were sent on the mission nevertheless left the presents they picked up at Batavia, gifts that were supplied by the Dutch, and they proceed to the city of Ayutthaya. While Vilbhagedra and the others do successfully make contact with the court of Ayutthaya's king Boromokot in the spring or early summer of 1747, the death of Kandy's king Srivijaya Rajasingha ultimately dooms this mission to failure too. Once news of the death of the Kandyan king reaches the Siamese court, the Ayutthhayan king Buromukod ultimately decides not to supply monks until assurances are made in the form of another Pali language letter sent by the new Kandyan monarch of his enthusiastic support for the mission and his assurances about the safety and the well-being of Ayutthha's monks. Thus, Vilbhagedra, the remaining envoys, and their entourage return to Kandy a second time, having once again made contact with Southeast Asian Buddhist courts, but without obtaining any monks. It would take another 3 years until the coronation of Srivijaya's successor, King Kirtishri Rajasingha, for a third mission to organize and depart from Siam in 1750. This time, it is eventually met with success, but only after a lengthy and protracted series of dangerous journeys and false starts, finally returning with the long-desired Siamese monks in the summer of 1753. Okay, so Kandy's king Kirtishri Rajasingha is coronated and assumes full overlordship of the kingdom in about January 1750. And he was, by all accounts, quickly convinced by that ambitious and erudite novice monk Velavita Saranankara to work with the VOC a third time to dispatch a mission in search of ordaining monks. In fact, the Siamupasampada explicitly gives Saranankara credit for inspiring the new monarch to restore the Kandyan monastic lineage with Siamese monks, relaying that, quote, the new king, Kirtishri Rajasingha, was instructed in the doctrines of Buddhism and in the laws of the land by none other than the priest Saranankara. Being informed that there was not a single ordaining monk in the whole of Lanka, he resolved that he would glorify the religion of Buddha by ordering the ministers to proceed to Siam with valuable presents, royal letters, and priestly offerings. The Yodaya Yazowin, one of the many, many different versions of the Ayutthayan historical chronicles from the period, contains a translation of Kirtishri's royal letter from 1750. In it, the Kandyan king is reported to have written to his Siamese counterpart that, quote, the religion of the Lord Buddha is in decline. There is no one to teach the scriptures. I send ministers requesting your majesty to provide monks who can provide instruction in the 3 gems, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and the rest of the scriptures, and to exalt the religion. Previously, a royal letter and presents were sent to the Burmese king, but those ministers and the seamen had to return. This version of King Kirtishri Rajasingha's royal letter is noteworthy, I think, for a number of reasons. Most importantly, because it suggests that the needed monks should be able to, quote, provide instruction in the 3 gems and also to exalt the religion. These are important clues into the religious orientations and concerns of the participants in these voyages, who would later go on to characterize the importance and the eventual success of their endeavors with reference to the centrality of the Buddha, the body of his teachings, the Dharma or Dhamma in Pali, and to the community of nuns and monks, the Sangha. 3 interdependent sources of refuge, there's that word again, and veneration for Buddhist people. In fact, taking refuge in the triple gem, the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, is a foundational ritual practice for Buddhists the world over, one that cuts across the rich diversity of Buddhist traditions and languages. Okay, so the 1750 to 1753 mission is now headed by the now experienced Vilbhagedra, along with 2 other envoys, whose names were Elepola and Etheliade. The envoys and the novices depart Kandy on July 12th, 1750. They arrive at the port of Trincomalee several days later, and I promise we'll see a map of this momentarily. From there, they set sail on August 1st aboard the VOC ship Waldreich, And after about a week or so at sea on August 9th, their travelogues record that, quote, a storm overtook us and the ship was in great danger. 2 masts and sails and several ropes were destroyed. The ship was driven round and round. In our peril, we consoled ourselves with the reflection of the threefold gem, again, the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, until our gallant captain, not my translation of this text in particular, until our gallant captain came to try and cheer us up. We then roughly repaired the damage and drove the ship before the wind for 12 days and nights without ceasing. Okay, so here again, we see evidence that the Kandyan envoys participated in the Buddhist ritual of taking refuge in the triple gem, paying homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha amidst a perilous and uncertain moment as a way to seek consolation and solace. Soon after, they sail on toward Malacca with the benefit of patchwork repairs to sails and masts. They arrive safely in Malacca, where they wait for suitable winds to carry them north toward Siam. When they set sail again some weeks later, the Elepola Eteliada travelogue suggests that the conditions were still not entirely suitable, and they tack back and forth, back and forth, back and forth for several days, trying to make headway. But they begin to drift too far south, and thus they're forced to return to Malacca for the next 6 months until the monsoon winds change. Finally, in late March or early April 1751, they again depart Malacca aboard the Waldreich and sail toward the Gulf of Siam, this time without incident. Along with the envoys, the VOC governor in Malacca also dispatches instructions for the company's Ayutthaya trading fort related to the quantity of sapan wood, tin, and rice needed in Batavia from the company's Ayutthayan colony. And I mention this because they weren't just shipping these envoys, right? These were huge, hulking Returskapa, or return ships, big cargo ships. The company's commercial drive is always operating in the background. So they finally reach the Gulf of Siam and the mouth of the Chao Phraya River near present-day Bangkok, which the Dutch called Amsterdam, in late May or early June. Upon reaching the mouth of the Chao Phraya River, leading to the heart of the Siamese kingdom, quote, when we dropped anchor, the Hollanders' flag was lowered and the lion flag of Lanka was hoisted at the masthead. I think that given the VOC's strategic use of Kandy's desire to obtain Ayutthayan monks as a pretext for reestablishing its trading position in both kingdoms, it's not at all surprising to me that upon entering the waters of the Siamese kingdom, they lower the company's flag from the mast and instead hoisted that of the Kandyan kingdom in an attempt to demonstrate both to Ayutthayan forces who guarded the waterways and to the Kandyan envoys that the company really was doing this in their service and not because of its own economic and political motivations. And I have a lot more to say about that later on in this project, but we'll sort of leave that there for now. The envoys, the novice monks, and their entourage are then treated to a lengthy and elaborate procession up the Chao Phraya River with many stops at Buddhist temples and sacred sites along the way. They arrive at the court of Ayutthaya's King Boromokot in the heart of the city in July 1751, where they have a series of audiences with the king at which they present, at long last, the royal letter from the living king, Kirtishi Rajasingha, along with numerous gifts and other tokens of the Kandyan court's friendship. The moment in which the Siamese king, Boromokot, agrees to dispatch monks to Kandy, along with his selection of specific members of the Sangha to make the voyage in order to conduct new ordinations there, is recorded in detail in a number of Kandyan as well as Ayutthayan sources. In Vilbhagedera's travelogue, we learn that this occurred on or around November 6th, 1751. Having presented King Boromokot, sorry, I lost my place. Having presented the Ayutthhan king with the Kandyan royal letter and the various gifts, he is reported to have entrusted to them an image of the Buddha, 2 boxes of texts on the Dharma, a royal letter of his own, many gifts to be presented to our, i.e. the Kandyan king. He also formally presented to them the 24 monks who were headed by Upali Mahathera and 3 envoys. In Siamese sources such as the Ayutthaya Chronicles, the Pongsawadan Krungsi Ayutthaya, we find a similar account of King Brahmagot's decision to dispatch monks headed by Upali Mahathero. The chronicles relay that the Siamese king, quote, had the Reverend Upali and the Reverend Arya Muni, along with 12 novice monks, invited to go out to establish the holy Buddhist religion and to ordain noble youths within the continent of Lanka. Hidden amongst these details is another that will soon become important, I think, to how the success of the return voyage was later memorialized. Amongst those gifts, letters, texts, ritual objects, and of course monks, selected by King Brahmakot, is a gold statue of the Dipankara Buddha, an earlier Buddha, long before Siddhartha Gautama, from a far distant earlier epoch. And here we see a Chinese image of the Dipankara Buddha here on the right. This Dipankara Buddha in particular, a Buddha again of eons past, is strongly associated with the protection of sailors in seafaring Buddhist communities across the Bay of Bengal and even across the South China Sea. His name, not at all incidentally, translates both to the calmer of waters as well as the bearer of either island or continent. And it's that term Deepa, or in Sanskrit Dvipa, right? A common epithet at the time for Sri Lanka, literally a continent which loomed large in the early modern Thai Buddhist historical memory. Now, with knowledge that the voyages thus far had all been beset by perilous dangers on monsoon waters and in foreign lands, the fact that King Brahmakot selected this Buddha, amongst many others, to accompany the monks and envoys indicates, I think, a strong connection between a ritual Buddhist imaginaire and real-world practices of protection from danger. This connection becomes important to how Upali in particular, and the Siamese monks, manage the dangers they'll soon face on their lengthy and protracted return voyage to Kandy. King Brahmakot, for his part, also decided that the monks would sail on a Siamese vessel rather than the Dutch one. In their travelogues, we learn that the king personally invited Vilbhagedra to accompany the Siamese monks on the Ayutthhan vessel, rather than sailing back with the other envoys and attendants and their retinue on the VOC's ship. And this was, and the text suggests that this was because he was well known to the Siamese monks and their ambassadors. He had, after all, already been to Siamese territories on 2 previous occasions, and thus King Brahmakot decides that he should sail back with the monks on the Siamese ship. So at this juncture, Vilbhagedra and the monks will soon set sail aboard a Siamese vessel, whereas Alepola, Eteliada, and the other envoys will depart on a Dutch ship, the Tulpenberg, which also contained a large shipment of rice bound for Colombo. The Tulpenberg and the Siamese ship depart at around the same time, on or around December 4th, 1751, but they soon lose sight of one another. And so for this reason, the Vilbhagedra travelogue on the one hand, and what I'm calling the Alepola Eteliada travelogue on the other hand, begin to diverge a lot, following their separate and remarkably different return journeys back to Kandy. In Vilbhagedra's travelogue, we discover that on approximately December 7th, 1751, within a few days of their departure aboard the Siamese vessel, and after losing sight of the Tulpenberg, quote, water leaked into the ship at numerous points. Water entered the ship in spurts as thick as an ankle or a wrist, and the ship began to sink. Valuable articles stored in the ship were jettisoned, and the monks began to preach the Dhamma both day and night. Because of this, all persons on board and the gifts were saved. Then, when they were about to reach Muan Lakhon, or what the Dutch called Likor, or what is nowadays called Nakhon Si Thammarat in southern Thailand, a territory that belonged to Siam, the ship sank in the mud, but no one was injured, and all on board landed safely. Here, Vilbhagedra suggests that due to the vigilant Dharma preaching by the Siamese monks, the passengers and the priceless religious objects were all spared the worst of the storm. The Yodaya-Yazawin, again, a slightly different version of the Ayutthaya Chronicles, also recounts the events of this storm, but from the perspective of Upali and the other Siamese monks. Quote, Patriarch Upali and the monks carried the image of the Dipankara Buddha and placing it in the prow of the ship, recited the attributes of the Lord Buddha and the sutras of protection. When the approaching storm gained in strength and nearly the whole of the sky had turned red because of the image of the Dipankara Buddha and the recitation of the attributes of the Lord Buddha and the protective sutras, great waves rose up, but they subsided when they reached the vicinity of the ship. So when a storm threatens the success of the mission and the lives of monk, envoy, trader, and Buddha alike, Upali and the others conduct a ritual by chanting protective Pali language suttas and ritual formulae in the presence of the Dipankara Buddha statue, whose virtuous attributes they recite as a protective act of seeking refuge, not unlike the Bodhisattva in the Jataka story I started this talk with. And I think this chronicle wants us to understand that through the virtue and merit of not only this act in particular, but also of the auspicious mission to support a declining Buddhist lineage abroad, the storm, we are told, miraculously moves safely to the side without harming the ship. Buddhist ethics, in other words, are understood to have protective effects in the real world. Now, having faced the storm and passing through unscathed, they subsequently run aground on a sandbar off the coast of Ligor. After nearly sinking, the Siamese monks, their attendants, and Vilbhagedra disembark for the shore, and the ship returns empty-handed to Ayutthaya to be repaired. Meanwhile, the Tulpenberg with Elapola Ecliada, sorry, I made the mistake of being in shorts here in Sri Lanka as dusk is coming and the mosquitoes are out. Okay, so the other envoys sail to Malacca without difficulty after losing sight of the Siamese vessel. There, they soon learned that the Siamese ship had encountered trouble and was disabled, but they're unable to obtain any further details. And so, without any definitive information about the whereabouts of Vilbhagedra, Upali, and the Siamese monks, Elapola, Ecliada, and the others wait in Malacca until they can learn more. Okay, so this is what their return voyages ultimately look like. And I'll unpack this. This is, I think, ultimately way too much visual information for one map. And as I kind of work on adapting this story into a book, I'm gonna split this up, but bear with me for a minute. So Vilbhagedra and the monks soon receive instructions to make their way back overland from Ayutthaya, or to Ayutthaya rather, where they subsequently negotiate with the VOC agents as well as with the Ayutthayan court directly to arrange another attempt to return to Kandy. At some point in mid-1752, the company's chief in Ayutthaya, his name was Nicolas Bang, permits the monks and envoys the use of his personal ship for their return. Finally, in early 1753, Vilbhagedra and the Siamese monks depart Ayutthaya for the last time. In his travelogue, Vilbhagedra remarks that he, along with Pra Upali, the other senior Ayutthayan monks, and an entourage of approximately 70 others, board a ship, presumably that of Nicolas Bang, on or around January 21st, 1753, from Mergui. They arrive in Batavia on March 8th without report of any difficulties. A few weeks later, on March 25th, Vilbhagedra reports that he and the monks board a VOC ship which I found out in Dutch sources was named the Oostkapelle, and soon they set sail for Batavia. He makes no mention whatsoever of the events during this leg of the voyage, and by all other accounts, the Oostkapelle encounters no trouble at sea. Meanwhile, the other Candian envoys who were directed by Vilbegedra to return while they were in Malacca had in fact already arrived in Colombo on January 14th aboard the VOC's ship, the Toppenberg. At last, 4 months later, on May 14th, 1753, the Oostkapelle, containing Vilbegedra, Pra Upali Tero, and the other Siamese monks, was finally spotted approaching the port of Trincomalee, where it soon anchored. Vilbegedra reports that they were received by Dutch forces, quote, with great ceremony. Okay, so if we follow the VOC ship with Elapola, Etiliada, and the other envoys, right, that both ships depart Ayutthaya, they become separated about here. They go to Ligor, where they wait to find out what, they go all the way down to Malacca while they wait to find out what happened to the Siamese ship. Once they learn that the Siamese monks and Vilbegedra are in fact on their way, they make their return to Colombo. Meanwhile, in the far more complicated and fraught voyage of Vilbegedra, Pra Upali, and the other Siamese monks, they encounter the storm on their way south. They limp their way to Ligor, where they make their way overland back to Ayutthaya, and then they wait again until mid-1752, where they sail to Mergui, and then all the way down to Batavia, and eventually make their way to Trincomalee. Once they get there, they're soon conducted in palanquins by a royal entourage over the steep mountain passes to Kandy. And when the procession arrives at a city quite near Kandy called Alutgandhota, about 6 kilometers north of the royal palace, the king, Kirtishri Rajasingha, personally welcomes them and conducts them into the Malvata Rajamaha Vihara, one of Kandy's central Buddhist monasteries, and the home of that ambitious and learned novice monk, Velavita Saranankara. The collective travelogues end with an account of the long sought-after ordination ceremony conducted the following month for Velavita Saranankara and his students by Pra Upali Mahatero and the newly arrived Siamese monks. This takes place in an ordination platform newly consecrated by Upali and the others in the heart of the Malvata Rajamahavihara complex. The envoys recount that under the July full moon in 1753, quote, King Kirtishri took his seat in the preaching hall, filled with exultant joy and kindness. And at his request, which was addressed to Upali Mahatero, the novice monks Kubekadua, Velavita Saranankara, Hulangamua, Bambaradenia, Tibatuvava, and Navina were admitted into the order of monks. And thus, after many years, this feast of the Great Ordination, which had so long been neglected in Lanka, was reestablished once more amidst the rejoicing of the populace, the triumphant noise of drums, chanks, the 5 kinds of music, and the roar of a cannon. At long last, after more than a decade of diplomatic red tape and multiple dangerous sea voyages, Saranankara had succeeded in what his biography describes as a nearly lifelong ambition to restore the full monastic ordination, and he was thus accordingly amongst the first to receive it from Upali, but not before insisting that the custodian of the Malvata temple, a monk named Kubekadua, receive the higher ordination first. And I asked about this. I spent a lot of time at the Malvata Vihara when I'm in Kandy, right? Like hanging out in the very same ordination platform that was established in 1753. And so I asked about this from some of the monks who currently live at the Malvata Vihara. And they told me that Saranankara was so pious, so self-effacing, that he first wanted to have another more senior, fully ordained monk to venerate before he received his own ordination. And folks here who are familiar with the history of Buddhism in Sri Lanka will recognize this as the foundational moment of the establishment of the Siam Nikaya, the largest and most influential fraternity or ordination lineage of Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka today. I'd estimate something like maybe 60 or maybe even 70% of all the Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka belong to this lineage. In fact, ordinations for monks in the Siam Nikaya are conducted just once a year between the May and June full moons in that very same ordination hall consecrated by Upali in that July evening in 1753. And I spent several days there a week ago, just hanging out, watching ordinations take place in that same ordination platform, first put into use in the mid-18th century. Okay, I want to start kind of bringing this to a close so that we have plenty of time for discussion and Q&A. So on March 11th, the following year, 1754, the VOC fort in Colombo receives a letter from none other than the Siamese head monk, Pra Upali Mahatero, who by this point had been in Kandy for 10 months, performing ordinations and consecrating new ordination platforms throughout the kingdom. And while the original Sinhala or Thai language original, or even potentially Pali language original, has long been lost, the VOC translated that letter. And I think that translation is nevertheless valuable because Upali's voice appears literally nowhere else in the extant sources that I've been hunting down since 2018. And in the Dutch translation of the letter, at least, the monk says, quote, "From the day we left our country and arrived here, we have not suffered any deprivation by virtue of the goodness of the Hollanders, het Hieren Hollanders," he says. "Having shown many tokens of affection to the chief priests and more, everything they assured us beforehand has well and truly happened. After our landing at Trincomalee, the chief there also showed us much honor and respect. Therefore, for all of these boons the company has demonstrated, we will forever keep your honorables in memory." Even though he makes no mention of trouble at sea, his gratitude and relief at having arrived safely after receiving presumably many assurances from the ship's authorities seems clear, but I also think we need to take a source like this with a great deal of circumspection, given that the VOC's translators had definite agendas and epistemological biases that impacted the monk's words as they appear to us now. And so I think underneath the VOC's kind of colonial subjectivities and its preoccupations, its desire to take credit for the success of the third mission, it's still worth considering that Upali grew up and made his life as a monk amidst the bustling imports and exports of the fertile upland delta of the Chao Phraya River in and around the Ayutthaya capital. In this politically and economically cosmopolitan zone at the center of the Siamese kingdom, represented by this Dutch etching from the late 17th century, Upali likely participated in overland or riverine Buddhist pilgrimages and other sort of forms of movement, but I think it's doubtful that he engaged in any overseas travel prior to his attempts to reach Kandy. And so after many false starts, after several fatal and near fatal shipwrecks, much trouble at sea, and the loss of life of his fellow monks and envoys, the prospect of sailing with Dutch traders to a distant land over the monsoon seas to a place far away would have indeed been quite daunting. The reply to Upali was drafted by none other than the Dutch governor, Johan Gideon Loten. It's full of reciprocated diplomatic overtures of honor and friendship, the acknowledgement of Upali's invocation of the millennia-old interrupted Buddhist friendship between Siam and Lanka. So the governor writes in just giving just a small snippet of this, quote, "I express my singular happiness for the friendly communication so amicably exchanged. and I give the assurances of my willingness to please your honorables to the best of my ability, as I have always tried to execute good services for the great court. All right, what have we learned from all of this? With the growing popularity of connected historical methodologies, indebted to historians like Sanjay Subramaniam and those following in his wake, it's become quite popular to write narratives of diverse events and processes taking place across disparate geographic and cultural spaces as part of a shared, connected historical flow. And yet, in drawing together sources from these diverse genres, places, and languages to tell a story of transoceanic religious connectivity mediated by the desires of Southern Asian courts and European trading empires both, I want us to see how difficult, how dangerous, how transactional it was in the first place to forge religious diplomatic connectivity in the mid-18th century, and at the same time, to examine the motivations and the religious orientations of those who undertook these hazardous journeys, considering why they accepted the risks and how they faced the difficulties they encountered. And so my synthesis here of Kandyan, Ayutthaya, and Dutch materials speaks to the way that monks and envoys managed the dangers of early modern maritime travel in the late age of sail, the ways in which Buddhist ritual practices of protection and veneration featured in their accounts and successes as part of a living ritual tradition indebted to the inspiration of previous generations of Buddhists. I'm sorry if the volume is maybe decreased in quality. It is really raining out there. These practices are not, I've tried to argue, simply the allegorical or ethical topoi of a pre-modern Buddhist literature and iconography filled with mythical creatures and supernatural acts of protection in service of moral pedagogy and reflection, but rather sources of inspiration for the lived experiences of real seafaring Buddhists for whom the formation of religious friendship between Kandy and Ayutthaya was understood as a virtuous and praiseworthy endeavor, the moral duty owed to one's friends on opposite sides of a dangerous sea. Instead of nation states and static ideas about borders and areas, by getting into the boats with Lankan, Siamese, and Dutchmen, by following their journeys, we find ourselves in a porous and peripatetic maritime world, circumscribed by the everyday dangers and opportunities of mobility in the mid-18th century, in which the journeys of all kinds of people, Southern Asian religious adepts and envoys, as much as European explorers, missionaries, and traders, crossed, and later in the story, a whole other chapter, crossed and even transgressed maritime frontiers in service of religious connection, marked by moral duty, courageous ritual action, and the formation of religious friendships across perilous waters and in foreign lands. All right. Thank you so much for coming today. I've had a lot of fun putting this together for all of you, and I can't wait to learn what questions, reflections, insights, or reflections you have. Thank you so much.